Welcome to Rappler Talk. I am Ralph Rivas. Well, the Philippine Stock Exchange Index, or PSEI, is fighting to stay above the 7,000 level. This after it ventured into bear market territory. Our stories on that gained thousands of likes and shares and garnered even more questions like, what is a bear and why is the PSEI flirting with it? A colleague of mine even asked, why are we talking about bears and flirting in relation to the Philippine Stock Exchange or the stock market? Well, guys, listen up. Welcome to Rappler Talk. We have Luis Limlingan, Managing Director of Regina Capital, to walk us through the stock market. Welcome, Luis.
Thank you for
Hi,
having
first
me.
time here. So, very basic, Luis, for our viewers over Facebook. What is a stock and what is a stock market?
Okay, just to make it very simple for the audience and for those who haven't really participated in the stock market, a stock is a ownership, is a partial ownership of a company. So you probably might, some might have their own businesses, right? And when they divide the ownership, when if it's a corporation, right? Usually they'll have shares. So that's also the same as what's happening in the stock market. The thing is, in the stock market, as opposed to having your own business, having your own business is a private venture, but the stock market is public, meaning anyone can buy into it. Whereas a private company, it's much more difficult, right?
Okay, so for a company, why would I want to share something to the public? Akin lang yun eh, and I want my own money and I want to be rich now. Or I want, yun. So parang bakit mo kailangan i-share to the public yun?
Well, when a company goes public, they ask other the I guess the general population if they want to participate. So they raise funds through what is called an IPO. We can go there later, but what you have to understand is that company is probably trying to expand, and they've exhausted all the means possible. So we've seen companies raise billions of pesos in a public offering. So by going public, they allow the individuals to be part owners of the company, right? By putting their money in. In exchange, they become owners and they share in the profits or the future profits of the company. Hence, that's the need for the IPO to become much bigger. Also, I think there's an added, I guess, benefit because to become a listed company in the exchange, you have to pass very strict criteria.
Such as?
Well, you have to have a certain size, you have to be generating very strong revenues, and you have to be profitable for a certain number of years. There's a long laundry list, in fact. And if you are able to meet these, and if you're a public company, and let's say you are still local, I guess if you want to grow your business, you have to go globally, right? But when you go to a company that is global, right, has a huge footprint, and you say that you're listed on the stock exchange, that already ticks a lot of marks for that potential partner or investor, right? Because this company is listed on the exchange, so they're very credible, right?
Okay, so for example, I'm not invested in the stock market, so why should I invest? Parang why I could just save it in the bank, and my interest naman dun.
That's true. A bank is I guess a safe haven to store your money, but you're only getting around 1 to 3% interest. Let me put it. Let me start with a case. For example, I'm sure you've been asked to use some of your savings at some point in your life to put up a business, right? And why would you want to put your money in that business?
Kasi kikita siya. Parang it looks profitable.
Exactly. So, for example, you put your money there, which is earning, let's say you put 10,000 pesos, right? And someone invites you to a business and say, well, you put 10,000 in, we're going to grow this business, and next year it will make 20%, right? It's worthwhile to put it than leaving in the bank. That is the same case with putting it in companies listed on the exchange. You're taking a risk because you believe that there is great earnings potential in that company, right? It's going to be more valuable, or pay you in terms of net income. So you're planning to make money two ways, through the profits and through the value of that company.
Okay, so how high are the returns are we talking about? Parang gaano kataas ba usually?
Well, on average, I've done a study, and this was going from 1989 up till the end of last year. Now, I chose those specific dates because I just wanted to show how great the potential is. Now, 1989, the index was doing around 1100, but because of the events which was more circling around the coup attempt, we fell to around 650. So we fell more than 40%. Now, I'm giving that an example because that was a bad start. So imagine if you put the index, right? On average, you're buying at 1100, and on average, companies were down 40+%, right? You hold those companies and you bring it forward till the end of this year, you would still be making on average 7%. So that excludes the cash dividends being paid out. We can tackle that later. But based on just the value of the company, on average, you'd be making 7%, despite losing 40+% on the first year. Now, if you take out those extreme cases and you just put it, or regularly put it, right?
Like right now? Or?
Like right now, you put it every month. Usually, you'd be making around 9 to 10% on average on a yearly basis, and that's compounded. So it's really good. Whereas
Profitable.
Yeah. Whereas you're just making maybe 1-2% in the bank, in best case, even if rates are going high, it doesn't, it's not a good, or rather, putting it in the bank is not as good as putting to stocks, knowing that it can return so much.
Okay, so here's a question from my friends. Usually parang, magkano ba dapat ang ilalagay? Parang, is there an amount na like 5,000? Is that a good amount?
Okay. I guess why people cannot answer it is, and the way when people ask me that is, I have to throw it back to them. I say, what is worthwhile to you? So if I told you that you can earn 7 to 8%, right, on average, right, just based on the statistics. Of course, there are years where, like now, that it's down, right? But on average, if you keep it 10, 15 years, you might stand to earn around 7% on average, right? Is it worthwhile to you? So for some people, if they put 10,000 and they know that they're going to be making, on average 7%, right? On some issues, on average, on some years it might overperform. It might do 15%. On some years it might do, it might fall below, right? But on average, if it does 7%, it's worthwhile for them, even if it's 10,000. I know I've met clients, even if they say they have, $500,000, right? And they're only gonna make 7%, it's not worthwhile for them. Maybe they just put it in their own business. So for me, I tell clients, these are the facts. This is how much the stocks have been making in previous periods, and hopefully history repeats itself, as they like to say. Now, if they're happy with that, then they should put that amount. So that's what I throw back to them. And second, after analyzing that, how much of that is disposable income, meaning they don't need it, because it will work against their strategy. If, let's say, they're saving it, to pay for a house, or for a car, right? Because they might need the money immediately. So it might destroy the strategy. So that's why I say, make sure you're aware, or make sure that it's money that's worthwhile for you to invest if you put it into stocks, and it's something that you don't need immediately in the near future.
Okay, so halimbawa, naglagay ako ng pera dyan, how soon can I take out and then put it in another company?
Well, you can do it actually immediately during trading hours. So from Monday to Friday, that's trading hours. Now, from 9 to 9:30, you can put in orders, but they're not yet matched. Okay, from 9:30 until 12, there's a lunch break, so you can trade, and then that resumes from 1:30 to 3:30. But at 3:20, there's a fixed price. Okay, if let's say, for example, you call me tomorrow is a Thursday, and it's 10 o'clock, and say, I want to buy this company at this price, whatever it's doing right now. And then you say, well, actually, I've changed my mind, I made a mistake. I'll transfer to this company. We can still sell it, and we can transfer this on instantaneously, so long as you're happy with the price.
Okay, so we're talking about companies here, pero let me also discuss about there's a index, yung mga index, Philippine Stock Exchange Index, there's mining and oil, there's holdings. Tell us more about that. Bakit may, what's the difference between that and an ordinary company?
Well, the index is supposed to be it's a gauge of how the Philippine companies are doing. Now, to become part of the 30-member index, you have to have a certain size. Again, it's much more stringent, a certain market cap, profitability, right? And these 30 companies should well represent the Philippine economy. So you'll have the biggest banking stocks, the biggest retail companies, the biggest property companies that are all in the index. And of course, there are sub-indices, because even if you can't make it into the PSEI, take note that I said there's 30 companies listed there. We have a little more than 250 companies listed on exchange. They're categorized under another index. So there's one, as you said, for property, there's one for banking, there's one for holding, one for services, and so on.
So these you were talking about 30 companies. What are they called ba? Parang why what about the 30 companies? Why should people zoom in and focus on those 30 companies?
Well, for one, they are the largest listed companies in the Philippines, and they more or less represent the Philippine economy in terms of growth. So, for example, you have SM, you have Ayala, you have the companies run by the Gokong Ways, and these are the largest companies, and these are the ones, I guess, if there's any, good or bad shocks to the economy, they're going to feel it, right? So it's going to directly impact them rather than, I guess, a smaller business, right?
Okay, so you were talking about returns on average around 7%, right? Right on an average.
Of 30
So,
years.
in 30 years. So what are the factors that affect the stock price ba? Parang usually parang in news reports, parang everybody's getting excited na sobrang taas ng company na to, pero may ibang bumabagsak. We were talking about bears. We'll get to there much later. Pero what are the factors that affects the stock's price ba?
Well, stock price basically, and just to make it simpler, is like it's profitability. So let's just use the example I mentioned a while ago about putting up your own business. So if you decide to put up a restaurant business, right, and then you find out that cost of goods are becoming higher, what happens? Your profitability is going to be affected because your costs are higher. You don't know if you're going to raise the price because it might deter customers. Now, magnify this so many times, right? You have like a Jollibee, right? You have a URC, for example. Now, how does one economic data point such as inflation impact it? It's the same way as it impacts your business. So that's what you look at, and every so often there's so many data points that we look at, and we try to analyze whether or not this will affect the future profitability of the company, and that's what affects the stock price.
So ang daming factors in play.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
So what about internal factors? Let's talk more about inflation. Kasi for instance, the Department of Finance, may outlook sila na 4.9 daw this June, although official inflation data would be available tomorrow at 9. So paano nakaka-apekto yung inflation?
Well, as I said a while ago, the inflation it represents a basket. So if the consensus is around 4.8 to 4.9% tomorrow, that's the average item of goods that a regular Filipino consumer will buy. So that includes food, electricity, right, transportation. I think there's even what you pay for education, for example. So that's a basket. Now, when we see the breakdown, that's when we see, well, for example, as when we analyzed last month, we saw the basket and we broke it down. Let's say food grew faster, but let's say, for example, education didn't grow so much, or I think like machinery and equipment didn't grow so much. So those data points will affect some companies, we think, and others won't. So the obvious, or I guess for the audience, the easiest being food and transportation, right? If that continues to grow, then companies that need it for their business will be impacted. So for example, if the cost of these goods go up, let's say, the food companies might be affected, but maybe a telecom company not so much, because they're not really, dependent on the price of food, right? So that's why you could see some of these movements affecting more companies than others.
Okay, so this one, lagi ko nakikita sa social media, politics. Gaano ba nakaka-apekto yung politika sa stock market?
Well, the market just reacts to whatever the administration's policies are. So, if there's a pronouncement, or they change anything, for example tomorrow, right? Then the market reacts, or the company or the stock prices will probably adjust to how they perceive will be the impact. So I guess the big item, for the beginning of the year was train, right? Because on one hand, they're going to increase the basic salary of Pinoys, right? Because there's less taxes. But on the other hand, they'll tax other items, sugar, right? So for example, I think they were analyzing that maybe people will buy less of sugary drinks, right? It may or may not have been the case. There were others who were debating, well, even if they increase taxes on, let's say, tobacco products and alcohol, people will consume less. But it seems that it's not the case, right? Because we're all just making assumptions at the end of the day, and when the results come out, it will adjust accordingly.
Okay, so what about the peso? Parang does that affect anything? Like we're trading at 53 already.
Well, generally the impact is not as, I guess, is as huge as with other economies, but there still is going to be an impact, right? First you have to consider that there are winners and losers. Of course, the obvious winners are those who export and those who receive their revenue in dollars. Of course, importing becomes more expensive, right? So there's going to be winners and losers. Of course, if you have relatives who work abroad and they send dollars, right? They're going, whereas last year they were getting around 50 and a half to 51. Now it's 53. It's 53 and a half. So they're going to be winners and losers, and it's how those companies probably will react to that, or are going to be impacted by those changes in the peso, and that's going to affect the price.
Okay, so I'm sure you've done a lot of studies kung ano yung nakaka-apekto sa stock market. Pero ano ba yung mga napapansin mo recently na nakakapagpabago in the most general sense?
Well, as you said, it's still going to be inflation. And then, of course, the interest rates. Now, with inflation, because most companies are going to be affected, right, by the higher cost of goods. So, really, we have to make assumptions as to consumer behavior, which is very difficult because even with higher salaries, right, where will they spend? Because some items will be more expensive than others, right? Or all of them will increase, but some not as much. So we have to make assumptions, and it's something that we're getting used to because it's the first time they've tried it. Also with interest rates, because now the cost of borrowing and lending is much higher, and we've had very low rates of borrowing and lending for so many years, and now the question becomes, or what we're trying to analyze is, if it becomes more expensive for you to borrow, will it deter you, right? And we have to multiply this by 100 billion, because how will this affect, I can probably ask you, right? But for the other 100 million Filipinos, we just have to make assumptions. So these are the things that we're looking at right now.
Okay, so What about external ones like the U.S.? We've been talking about trade wars. If we can give a brief description about the trade war and how it's affecting. A brief description lang of the U.S. and U.S. trade war.
Well, we can see by the signals of what the Trump administration is showing is that they really want to prioritize the U.S. So if it becomes more expensive to ship, right, or products to and from the U.S., then probably a lot of these companies will be focusing on U.S. companies. They've also, I think, lowered the taxes, so a lot of these companies will be bringing in the money that they earn overseas into the U.S. Right now, so far, what the I guess the tariffs that they imposed don't affect a lot of the products that we try to export or import. Okay. The other thing is, well, we've noticed that from how the other countries are reacting is that, well, if it's going to be expensive to to export it to the U.S., they're going to look for other trading partners. So we might be a net beneficiary. So probably some goods might be might be more cheaper because, again, for example, if I think one point was, or one product that was under contention was steel. So if it's going to be more costly to sell steel from China to the U.S., they'll just sell it to the Philippines. And if there's more steel, right, then probably the prices might go lower. And of course, if there might be products where it might be much more difficult now to sell to the U.S., right? So we're going to see how it's going to balance out.
Okay, so we talk about the some of the factors that affect that. Pero I want to talk about some of the jargons naman. Kasi funny story kasi people were asking me na parang bakit ganito yung jargons? When you're writing about the stock market, merong bear, merong bull. So give us a background on that. What is a bull in the context of the stock market?
Well, those are the two animals that a lot of I guess people in the market use as a symbol. If you're saying that we're in a bull market right now, the market is going up, and they use a bull because it seems it's that the symbol of a bull is that it's charging, it's lots of energy, right? So it's trying to mimic that pattern of a bull, right? The second one is a bear, and they say that when the bear is we're in a bear market, it's usually that we're falling. That's because they like to use the bear when it hibernates as a symbol, right? It's sleeping, it's sluggish, right? So those are the two types of animals that they use. So if they say that right now we're entering a bear market, we're falling. So we're lagging behind.
Okay, so bear market, we're falling. Why? Anong mga nakikita mong factors? Parang is it how bad or how bad is it?
Well, you have to consider that a lot of, as I've been saying, a lot of the reason why these prices are going down, it's not just because the profitability is affected. In fact, for a lot of companies, they're going to be much more profitable than before, right? But why are they still falling? It's because a lot of these prices are based on two things. One is all the available information that is out there. So the price should reflect all the available information. The second is it's also based on future assumptions. So last year, there were a lot of assumptions made on how the companies would perform, and that's why I think we did pretty well. The index was up at least 25%, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was higher at some points. So we did overperform, and a lot of that was because at the end of last year, a lot of investors already were assuming that we would do much better, right? Much better than before. And it turns out, as we can see in the first quarter, it wasn't the case.
Ano nangyari? Parang in the graph nga, parang it reached 9,000 and then pook, it flirted 6.9 tapos nasa 7.3 ngayon. So what?
Well, I think in the first quarter, they were, touting the effects of train, that the impact would be minimal, that we wouldn't have to raise rates, but or we wouldn't have to raise rates as much to react, and that the peso wouldn't slide as much. The problem is that this didn't happen. So the earnings didn't come as good as expected. A lot, again, I have to say that a lot did perform better. I mean, better than last year. Second is, again, inflation went accelerated at a much quicker pace, and the third is that the interest rates, we were forced to raise it, but not quick enough, and that's why the dollar slid. Now, take note that 9,000, I think we were trading at close to 9,050, maybe even higher intraday. So everyone who was participating at 9,058, more or less, that was like the peak of many prices. So they began to sell, and we've been we've been trading either upward or flat for the last 10 years. This was in 2008. This was until beginning 2008, during the Lehman Brothers crisis, when we fell 50%. And the index at that point was doing around 1,800. So in the last 10 years, from 1,800, we've gone up to 9,000. So on average, prices have gone up 500%. So that's why it's been, you can see why it's a bit exaggerated, the selling, because maybe I'm just guessing that a lot of people are still selling because they made money. Sometimes it's a bit irrational because, again, everything is based on assumptions. And perhaps now, as you mentioned, the price was too low, and some have already started buying. So that's why I think there's a bit of I guess it bounced back.
So parang yung naririnig ko nga parang the stock market is the only market where people flee kapag may sale. So is it a good time to buy right now? Kasi prices are down. Is it a good time? Pero at the same time, people are asking, how low can the PSE or how low can the stocks go? So is it a good time to buy right now?
Well, I always tell I tell my clients, use a quote from my boss. It's always a good time to buy, but we can never tell the best time to sell, right? Why is that? Well, a lot of us like to do the cost averaging, right?
Okay,
Meaning,
can you explain it to us?
well, it's simply you set aside a portion of your income that you probably don't need. It can be monthly, it can be quarterly, it's up to you, but you set it aside. And we try to, as brokers, we try to help you time it as best we can when it's a good time to buy, depending on your window. So that's why we say it's always a good time to buy. And remember, if you, as I said, going back to my first example, if you look at the long term, okay, we're doing 7,300, but had you held some of these same stocks, from around 9-10 years ago, you're still actually earning. And there are a lot of people who just buy stocks. They've been doing it for 10 years, maybe even 20 years, and they're still in a good position. And we've been there before. Now, I'll go a bit further and make a comparison. Back in 2008, a lot of the biggest economies contracted. We saw negative growth, right? We barely avoided a recession. I think we were up 0.5% that year, and the index fell 50%. 50%. Now the index has fallen at if you use the high, right? I think we were down 20+%. By some, if you take into account the depreciation of the peso, if you're a foreign fund manager, it's more than 25%. Okay. Now, what is the reason for that? They think that the growth won't be as stellar, right? But if you look at the first quarter, we were close to 7% growth. 6.8, I think, is the projection for the rest of the year. The U.S. is also selling off because the economy is overheating. Okay. So if you compare the two, and in terms of the economy, right, we're still in a better position as of now. as of now compared to how it was 10 years ago. And yet we're down 25%, and 10 years ago we're down 50%. And you can see that there's a lot of overreaction. So that's why I think it's still a good time to keep on buying, because again, the profitability of some companies may be hurt, but in general, there are still a lot that are still going to be doing much better than last year.
Okay, I asked that kasi halimbawa kapag bull market, it's easy to understand. Like, parang tumataas yung prices. So, you're gonna buy, and then kasi people are assuming that it will tataas pa yung price. It's gonna earn more. But in this bearish times, you can't really tell na parang bababa ba to, or kailan siya aakyat ulit, or how low nga. So, what are your tips or advice for those that are wary at this point?
Well, one is to ask your broker about the financial stability of the company. How will the current events affect its profitability, right? And if they can answer it, and it's quite an answer that is that you can, one that is, aside from being reassuring, second, that you can understand it, then I say you should still continue to buy. The reason why I say is that I've seen a lot of people buy into a stock with only the reasoning that the price will go up, and there's no fundamental basis, right? Again, you have to look at how the profitability of the company in the future. Is it still going to earn more than the previous year, and probably in the next 3 to 5 years? If it can be justified and you understand the reasoning, then you should still keep on buying, because again, it's the sell of probably some of these prices is a bit overdone.
Okay, so a very practical question. Total, nandito ka na. Halimbawa, I have 10,000 pesos that hindi ko naman ginagamit. Saan ko ilalagay yun? Stock picks or any particular companies that you're looking at where it's generally safe, or ano ba? Yeah, so 10,000.
Well, what I do is, one is, first I will ask you, what is your background? Let's look first for companies that you're familiar with. So I've talked mostly to people who work in retail business, so usually they're more comfortable with retail. So we look for companies that they sort of have a keen sense on. So for example, I know someone again who, using the same borrowed example, they work in food. So we actually share anecdotes and analysis, because they know what's going on. So if they think that, let's say, a food company is not doing so well, and maybe it might be affected, I say let's hold off. But if some are exaggerated, then probably we buy into that.
Okay. So where can I get that information? Na parang the financial health of a company, parang kung ano pa yung mga bagong projects nila. Where can I get that?
Well, all the listed information should be disclosed by the PSE. So if you go to the PSE's website, all that information is available. So I'm not supposed to have more information than what you have. I can probably, I probably spend more time analyzing it because you have a full-time job, but it's part of what I do to look into these reports and try to make analysis. So everything should be available at PSE. You can download it online. No one should have an advantage as to how much information is released or to the timing. So everyone should have equal footing, and that's what makes the stock market great for investment, because everyone is treated equally.
Okay, so in this bear market, saan ko ilalagay yung 10,000?
I would still say to buy a lot of the index names. Now,
which are?
Okay, so as I said, there are 30 names, but I want companies that very much represent the index. And with 10,000, I don't want you to divide it so much while we're building it.
Since it's just 10,000, right?
So actually, there are 5 companies that constitute around 40% of the index. So, depending on the price, right, I would probably pick 3 names if you told me today, I have to look at which is probably a bit cheaper than the others. But those five, those include SM, that's SM Prime, AC, Ayala Land. Depending on what the price is doing, it could be a BDO, BPA, or JGS. So I would look at those 5 to 7 names. I'd probably narrow it down to 3, depending on the price right now, and probably a bit of analysis on how it's going to perform, in the next 2 to 3 years. Also depending on how much, what your time horizon is.
Okay, so for instance, I pick one of those companies, one of the 3 companies, and put it all there. How long should I put the money there?
Usually, my time frame is I'm very conservative because I like those companies because should the market conditions normalize, right? In let's say 3 to 4 years, you should be returning on average, again, as I said, around 7 to 8%, which has been the case of these same companies. Sometimes they overperform, sometimes they underperform. In years where they overperform, I would advise you sometimes to maybe sell or make a profit, because if they overperform, sometimes people get emotional. They feel that they're missing out on the opportunity, and they buy into the company at a very high price. So that's when I say sell. But right now, if you look, these companies are still doing much better than last year. A lot of these companies, the names that I mentioned, and yet their prices are much lower than before. So it goes against common sense. So I'd say let's buy into these companies.
So yun nga, as I was mentioning earlier, sale pero nobody's there. So we were talking about blue chips, right? Yung mga stable companies. Pero there are also those na people are keeping an eye on, na parang there's great potential. Like parang there's a lot of speculation that I think you know what I'm talking about. Like for instance, the third telco. A lot of people are banking on certain companies, like for instance, Now. Tell us about that. Parang paano yung laro sa pera when it comes to that?
Well, those type of events I try to stay away from, and I say it's really your choice, because that is your money at the end of the day. I can only advise you so much, but at the end of the day, you make the choice. I could be wrong, but and you could be right in this case. But I usually go with names, or I usually go what's in the news. I don't go with speculation, right? I know they've been the news has been mentioning so many players in the last year that have the potential to come in, but until it's final, you don't know yet. So probably I'd stick to something that is more I guess predictable. The earnings might not be as big, right? But at least you're not taking as much risk. On the other hand, if you still decide to make the risk and you call it correctly, then at least your reward will be much higher.
Kasi higher risk, high returns. Parang
Exactly.
So okay, so we're gonna look for some questions here. Like ito, usual na nakikita ko, pag bumagsak ang stock market, reflective ba ito sa ekonomiya natin? Is it an indicator of the economy's health?
Yes and no, because for one, sometimes it's overdone. So for example, when the inflation came out much higher during the beginning of the year, the stock prices went down. But it might have been a bit overdone, because a lot of people, or some people, were speculating that inflation might get much worse, for example, and it may or may not be the case. But the reason why it fell much more, because people are torn on what's going to happen in the future. So yes, but not entirely. So it's reflecting what's happening right now and the assumptions of many people looking into the future.
Okay, very quickly na lang, Luis, no. Are there tools for me to monitor to monitor or predict the stock price movement, for instance? And what can I look at ba? Parang may ganun ba?
There are indicators, but again, at the end of the day, you're just making assumptions. For example, you look at the value turnover, right?
Sorry, can you explain that more?
Meaning, for example, if a stock is, let's say, trading higher, and then there are a lot of buyers on that day, that means there's a lot of interest. So the assumption is it's going to continue. But if you consider, for example, a stock that has been trading higher just today, but you can see that not so many people are buying it. Maybe it was just a couple of buyers. There weren't enough sellers, so they had to buy at a higher price, and that's why it went up too much. Then you can probably make the assumption that it will probably go back a bit lower, and you can get it at a lower price.
Okay, so siguro, just to wrap up this conversation, Luis, any tips for those that are interested or those that are starting pa lang?
Well, first is pick a broker that you're familiar with, who can give you sound and good advice. If he can make recommendations that you understand as to why a company will perform better, then by all means continue using that broker. And second, buy into that company. But if there are questions, if there any question that I guess that are unanswered, then don't go into that company. Right? Because you're buying as an investor, and you should be familiar with that business. Maybe that business will perform well, maybe it won't. But you have to make sure that it checks all the boxes, right, for you. So start with that. And I guess to make it easier, get into something you're familiar with. If you work in an industry that has similar companies listed on exchange, try looking at those companies, because sooner or later you'll realize what's the relationship of all those companies when you start venturing into different sectors.
Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much,
Welcome.
Luis Limbingan, Managing Director of Regina Capital. Hope you learned something on today's Rappler Talk. I'm Ralph Rivas. Thanks for watching.